And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asban Team level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. So recently news broke about a potential Game of Thrones movie, which could be about literally anything and has no writer, director or story attached. Very promising stuff. This, combined with House of the Dragon's recent polarizing second season and the upcoming Night of the Seven Kingdoms spin-off coming ever closer, got me thinking about all the spin-offs and shows that didn't make it. Because surprisingly, despite Game of Thrones' tainted reputation, there were a lot of spin-offs in the works during its latter years. And some still are, although we don't know if they'll even happen or not. If you've followed my channel for a while, you'll know I've often made videos about unmade Doctor Who episodes, so I thought I'd extend that idea into my new beloved franchise. Of course, like I said, some of these spin-offs aren't actually cancelled and could probably end up being made, but the majority definitely will never see the light of day. So, without any further ado, here are Game of Thrones' failed spin-offs, and some still in development. So, to recap, Game of Thrones was a huge success. Starting with the very faithful Season 1, the series brought the worlds of Westeros and Essos to life on our screens, telling stories of flawed heroes, black-hearted scheming villains, and incredible magic. It was all very captivating and turned a popular fantasy book series into one of the biggest TV franchises of the 21st century. Naturally, due to all of this success, the show became bigger and more franchised than ever, raking in merch money and physical media sales, along with being used for all sorts of tie-ins and references in other media and adverts. There was an astonishing amount of hype and hope for Game of Thrones across all media, and at this stage fans still actually believed Winds of Winter might one day come out. How naive we all were. Anyway, even though the show's profile began to decline with Season 5 and then plummet and crash into a comical ball of flame with the embarrassing Season 8, there was still a lot of internal hope for spin-offs to carry on the franchise, be that continuations of the story itself or prequels fleshing out earlier events from much further back in the timeline of the world. After all, the world of Ice and Fire is incredibly rich and detailed with all sorts of history and potential, so it made a lot of sense to want to explore that on screen, especially if a show could come along and fix or redeem that terrible ending to the main show. Yes, our first port of call is Snow, the sequel spin-off first rumoured in 2022. Of course, this was far from the first spin-off in development, but I think it's the most fitting place to begin. Snow would have obviously centred around Jon Snow, ostensibly the main protagonist of Game of Thrones due to the spotlight on him throughout the series and his role in defeating Daenerys Targaryen at the end, along with he himself being the all-important combination of ice and fire due to his ancestry. The final scenes of the show saw Jon returning to the now destroyed Wall and crossing into the lands beyond to become a wildling, and I guess HBO thought Kit Harington foraging for rabbits and berries would make for a captivating continuation of the show. Obviously, like I mentioned, a show like this could have provided an opportunity to further clarify and fix some of the severe issues with the way the main show ended, especially since the new King of Westeros is a kid with no heirs, with no interest in making them, and he's most likely possessed by the creepy, untrustworthy Bloodraven. Great job, Tyrion. Did you not read the Dune series? Snow would probably have given them a chance to slap a plaster over the gaping chasm of Game of Thrones' ending and elaborate on the fates of characters like Jon, his sisters, his new king, the dragon Drogon, and all sorts. But the main problem is there's no story to tell. The main conflict of A Song of Ice and Fire is the threat of the Others, or in the show, the Night King. Now that he's dead, what is there for Jon to do beyond the Wall other than simply settle down and live a normal life? Sure, you could suggest that there's a new, bigger threat in the Lands of Always Winter, but then you're just kind of back to doing the same stuff again, and we all saw how that turned out with Star Wars. The spin-off idea was inherently flawed from the get-go. It spun off from an ending nobody liked, promising the returns of actors who don't want to be there, and it would be full of the same kind of fanfiction, no source material writing that everyone hated about Season 8. Therefore, it was no surprise when, earlier this year, Kit Harington confirmed that Snow had been shelved whilst still in development, according to the man himself. We all couldn't find the right story to tell that we were all excited about enough. And he's right. There's simply nowhere you can go with the concept in general. Season 8 took the winds out of the sails for interest in the future of Westeros. even if that meant seeing more of the true North and exploring those mysteries, which I love personally. In Harrington's statement, he did suggest that they might revisit Snow in the future, but I really doubt that, especially because he himself has recently been vocal about how exhausting it was in the last few years of Game of Thrones. I really doubt he's very willing to return as Jon, especially because he's also been one of the many actors to outright criticize the terrible writing of the final season, along with admitting he can't even watch House of the Dragon or rewatch Game of Thrones due to how long he already spent in that world, and by the end it was an absolutely miserable experience for all the actors involved. So that's the tale of the short-lived spin-off Snow, a show that never should have existed and thankfully never got the chance to. The same goes for our next cautionary tale, Blood Moon, which actually did almost exist. This show would have essentially have been the complete opposite of Snow, being set in the extreme past of Westeros and returning to the existential threat of the White Walkers. The Long Night is a mysterious, terrifying event in the past of the world. Over 8,000 years before the events of Game of Thrones, it's believed that the demonic Others emerged from the lands of Always Winter and began their conquest of Westeros, and brought with them the so-called Long Night. A winter that lasted a generation and brought the continent to its knees, before the first men and the children of the forest were able to prevail and create the Wall and the Night's Watch to keep the others at bay. It's a fascinating, dark period of Westerosi history, so I definitely understand why they would want to make a show all about it, especially because it has that familiar enemy. And thus, Blood Moon, the first Game of Thrones spin-off, was born and actually even made it to the pilot stage, with a $30 to $35 million pilot episode being filmed as a proof of concept to test whether the show would be worth pursuing. And spoiler, it wasn't, with this pilot episode getting a very poor reception and George R.R. Martin didn't even get to see it. By the sound of it, this again was the right idea, because it would have been a disaster if it went ahead. To begin with, what do we know about this pilot? Well, not much, but we do know that it would have focused on the wedding between a southern house, seemingly House Casterly, and a northern house, seemingly House Stark. And then it would have explored the history of the White Walkers. That's all the official stuff. But then you get the plot leaks, which suggest the show would have also featured Lan the Clever, who would go on to found House Lannister, along with the show having the Children of the Forest originally be indigenous humans who slowly become the children thanks to magic as they fight off the White Andal colonizers, which yeah, that's a bit questionable there. And that's the main issue with Blood Moon, since it gets so much lore wrong. From what we know, the Starks didn't necessarily exist at this point in time, since the house was founded by Brandon the Builder in the Age of Heroes. So in the time frame of Blood Moon, they'd either not exist yet, or still be a brand new house, hardly capable of securing a marriage with the rich and esteemed Casterlys all the way in the south. The pilot also suggests Winterfell already exists, which conflicts with a lot of existing hints that the castle was only raised after the Long Night, much like the Wall itself. It also seems like the Casterlys are already worshipping the Faith of the Seven, which again is wrong, since the religion only came to Westeros with the invasion of the Andals, something that didn't happen until like 2,000 years after the Long Night. Oh, but the show also changes that invasion to be within its own time frame, which is another mistake. Lastly, those Children of the Forest being humans contradicts the ancient magical forest cat elf vibe the books have always been adamant about, so it's just all over the place and a bad idea. It also doesn't help that the entire show would have been centered around something that only has a few lines of explanation within the books. Would-be showrunner Jane Goldman had to basically come up with everything herself and flesh out this entire period of the world, so it makes sense that most of it would be very inconsistent and not very good, because there's no point in making an adaptation of something with such little content to actually adapt. Therefore, Blood Moon was cancelled in October 2019, sparing us of what would have been the final nail in the franchise's coffin, and on the same day, House of the Dragon was commissioned. So we really were saved, regardless of what you think of House of the Dragon. Yes, the current direction of Game of Thrones spin-offs seems to be established Targaryen history, with House of the Dragon adapting Fire and Blood, and Knight of the Seven Kingdoms adapting the Duncan Egg novellas set 90 years before Game of Thrones. Unlike Blood Moon, these shows are dealing with events we know much more about, with entire books exploring those stories and providing a lot of context, settings, and characters. That hasn't stopped House of the Dragon finding controversy, of course, since it has made a lot of changes from the source material, but it at least remains somewhat faithful with the most important story beats, and it always has the excuse of Fire and Blood being a historical document with conflicting accounts. Hopefully, Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is even more faithful as a show, because that won't have the same excuse. But it definitely seems like the franchise is prioritising the more established Targaryen history, because George R.R. Martin himself seems to have kind of fallen out of love with the Starks in favour of the Targaryens. There have been many talks of a spin-off focused on Aegon's conquest, the big world-changing event where Aegon Targaryen invaded and conquered Westeros and formed the Six Kingdoms under his rule. It's one of the single most defining periods of the franchise's world building, with the creation of Westeros as we now know it, the destruction of Harrenhal and the building of King's Landing, the creation of the Iron Throne itself, and of course, the Targaryen dynasty. It's no surprise then that a prequel is apparently in development, with Mattson Tomlin in charge of writing. However, even though he's given an interview promising to respect the source material and treat it like a real history, the root problem is that Aegon's conquest simply isn't a good enough story for the visual medium, because there's no real drama there. Sure, there are lots of great battles, and there's definitely politicking, but the main driving force of the conquest is an overpowered trio of dragon riders sweeping aside any and all opposition and easily winning. It's that quick and one-sided. You wouldn't watch a World War II series where they're fighting against people from the 6th century. There's just nothing really there. It's not like the Dance of Dragons with its nuanced sides and complicated dynamics. Aegon's conquest is a great story, but it's honestly the one part of Aegon's life that couldn't be any worse suited for an adaptation. So unfortunately, I do think it would be a bit of a failure if this show does get made. I think it's very much the same with the potential Robert's Rebellion show a lot of fans have always hoped for, and one that is apparently in consideration, or at least it was back in 2021. Robert's Rebellion is, of course, the huge bloody war fought shortly before the events of both the books and the core show, seeing Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark take up arms against the Mad King Aerys and eventually overthrow him, setting the stage for everything we see in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a very important part of Westeros history, and again, I can understand the desire to see it play out in full, to give us looks at Robert Baratheon and Barristan Selmy in their primes, or epic battles like the Battle of the Bells and the Battle of the Trident, but it's not a story necessitating an entire spin-off, because we already know everything we need to know due to it being such important context for the main Game of Thrones narrative. It's definitely less one-sided than Aegon's conquest, so that's not the issue, but the events are simply too close to what we've already seen, so don't need an entire show, because there's only 14 years between the end of the war and the start of a Game of Thrones. And besides, we've already seen a bunch of the important moments of the war within Game of Thrones itself, with flashbacks to the deaths of Rickard and Brandon Stark, the marriage of Lyanna and Rhaegar, and the Tower of Joy confrontation. And the biggest issue of them all, of course, is the casting. With such a little gap between shows, the casting would have to be different, but it would cause a lot of visual dissonance. Ned Stark was already recast for that Tower of Joy flashback, but the more problematic ones would be with the established older characters like Tywin Lannister, Barristan Selmy, Balon Greyjoy, and so on, because 14 years wouldn't have changed them enough to look so differently by the time of the main show. I just think it's a bad idea and not a period of time that really needs to be covered, because we already have everything we need from it. And from the looks of things, the spin-off, if it ever was being developed, has been scrapped. So that's another bullet dodged. Thank God. This brings me to one of my main points regarding a lot of these potential or scrapped spin-offs. They're barking up the wrong trees. Either they're kind of lazy, like Robert's Rebellion and Aegon's Conquest, there's not enough material, like Blood Moon, or they're frankly the wrong direction full stop, like Snow. Hell, there was even a very early idea to have a Flea Bottom spin-off, which was cancelled in its earlier stages and never actually confirmed. But who on earth would ever want a Flea Bottom spin-off? It's just a terrible pointless idea for a show, especially because we already saw plenty of it in Game of Thrones itself. Hey, maybe, some animated shorts online, but not a whole show. I've mentioned it before on this channel regarding the newest Doctor Who spin-off, but spin-offs in general should be based around things the main property can't or won't tackle, because it allows things to breathe more and truly shine as a standalone thing. House of the Dragon works because it's divorced enough from the main storyline of Game of Thrones itself, while still maintaining familiar enough elements to justify it being within the same world, and the story is simply an interesting one people actually want to see, with enough existing material to draw from and adapt. So it works, much like A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms also will, hopefully. An interesting spin-off that seemed dead but has apparently since been revived is 10,000 Ships, a show which promises to tell the famous tale of Princess Nymeria, who took her people from Essos to Dorne and helped pave the way for the rise of the modern House Martell. Nymeria's story is a very interesting one, both in-universe and out. It's an epic biblical odyssey of a defeated princess taking her people into exile to escape Valyrian slavery, with a ragged fleet of supposedly 10,000 ships travelling from Essos to Dorne, with countless trials and tribulations over the course of this over 3-year journey through hell. It's fertile ground for a spin-off, 1,000 years before Game of Thrones, and a heroic, storied central figure whose legacy is baked within the history of Westeros. 10,000 Ships was being developed in 2022, with Martin confirming that writer Amanda Segel was showrunner and had delivered a couple of drafts, before Brian Helgeland revealed earlier this year it was scrapped due to it being a period too far removed from the original. According to Helgeland, the show would have been inspired heavily by Harryhausen's Sinbad films and The Odyssey, with Nymeria leading a raft city around what he called a fictionalized version of the Mediterranean. However, despite this show being supposedly cancelled by HBO, George R.R. Martin revealed in June that it was still ongoing, this time with up-and-coming playwright Ebony Booth writing a pilot for it. So who knows what's going on at the moment, especially since a pilot is never a guaranteed thing, like we saw with Blood Moon. And that's even if it gets greenlit to be filmed to begin with. So we have to wait and see, but as it stands, this might be the first unfairly cancelled Game of Thrones spin-off I've covered here. As Nymeria's story shows, Essos is by far the direction to look when it comes to spin-off shows, like with the scrapped Bravos show that was in development at one point, but we don't know anything about that. After all, everything is always so laser focused on Westeros when there's an entire bigger continent right across the narrow sea waiting to be explored deeper. Obviously, Daenerys' storyline in the books and show gave us a very good look at Essos, but there is still so much more to see and learn, since it's a continent shrouded in mystery and ancient, entrancing history and customs. It's so full of potential, and that shows with the potential animated show The Golden Empire, which is meant to focus on the land of Yi Ti, an imperial China-like empire in the far southeast of Essos, dating back tens of thousands of years, and by far one of the most advanced and developed cultures in the world of ice and fire. Yi Ti has never been seen in either the books or the show, but it has always been hyped up as something incredible, so it would make for a very interesting, different show that would thrive as an animation due to the very different visual style and culture of the location. According to Martin in 2022, the working title of the show is The Golden Empire, and it has a young writer on it with beautiful art and animation, but we don't know anything else about it. Due to the sheer length of time the titular Golden Empire existed, there's no way of knowing when it would take place, and there's not much source material to draw from, which could either be a benefit or a curse for the show, like we saw with Blood Moon. However, we don't know if the show is even still in development anymore. At the start of the year, Martin claimed that there were originally 4 ideas for animated shows, but 2 of the projects were shelved, and we don't know if the Golden Empire was one of these cancelled ideas. But whilst we're on the topic of animated spin-offs, let's look at our last show, one that is happening, but not how it was originally supposed to. I'm of course talking about The Sea Snake, or The Nine Voyages, as it was previously known. In House of the Dragon, the Lord of Driftmark Corlys Velaryon is an older figure, still able to fight, but long past his storied prime. The show doesn't show it much, but when you read Fire and Blood, you come to understand just how legendary Corlys was, and how he almost single-handedly made House Velaryon one of the richest houses in all of Westeros. This success is due to his famed 9 voyages, where he travelled all across Essos collecting riches and exploring. He had already been an accomplished sailor by this point. but the 9 voyages were his biggest achievement, taking his self-designed and built sea snake to places like Yee, Ashai, and the Shivering Sea, all mysterious places the franchise has yet to visit. Obviously, the sheer scale of these accomplishments and adventures are ripe for a spin-off, which was first reported in March 2021 as a live-action show, but due to budgetary constraints, this probably would never have worked as a live-action series because of how many ports would need to be created, and the fact almost the whole show takes place at sea. So in a sense, it was cancelled, but it was actually instead changed to an animated show to best utilise the medium for such exotic and constantly changing adventures. The pilot script for the Sea Snake was written by Bruno Heller, creator of Rome and Gotham, but that's all we really know right now. Unfortunately, despite his great performance in House of the Dragon, actor Steve Toussaint probably won't be returning as Corlys since the character is much younger in this period. But that's again assuming the show actually happens to begin with, since so many were already cancelled, as we've explored. But it's definitely one of the ideas with the most mileage and potential, especially because of how prominent Corlys is within the Dance of Dragons. So he's a great anchor character for a spin-off. Spin-off shows are a very tricky thing to pull off because there are so many variables. What works for some spin-offs can absolutely destroy others, and we can see that even within Game of Thrones' own ecosystem. Blood Moon was bad because of how much it has to invent, but the Golden Empire would likely thrive for that same reason, because it has so much more freedom. Hell, we can even see with House of the Dragon itself that a spin-off can struggle even with good source material. The world of Ice and Fire is incredibly detailed and extensive, so I'm really not surprised that there's this gold rush to flesh it out as much as possible. But to be completely blunt, most of these spin-offs are just terrible ideas or lazy adaptations of things that don't need to be adapted. So their cancellations and failures are actually a relief for the franchise and its future. We don't need to see what happened next for Jon Snow. We don't need a horrifically butchered version of The Long Night, or a boring adaptation of Aegon's Conquest. And hey, sometimes even if a spin-off show has a great idea or good source material like The Silmarillion, the show can suck. I'm looking at you, Rings of Power. I've recently been hyperfixating on Game of Thrones and the world of Ice and Fire, so I'm desperate to see and explore as much of this universe as possible, and all these spin-offs offer that promise. They just need to, actually be good. I didn't actually know about almost any of these spin-offs before making this video. I thought it was just Snow and Blood Moon that failed, so it's interesting to find out how many others there are, be they successes, failures, or their status remains to be seen. So I hope you enjoyed this journey as much as I did. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Matthew Burns, and my Gold level patrons Chris Douglas and Daniel Shillito. Thank you so much for your support.